Okay, everyone, it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just briefly, though, once again, my name is Jennifer Peltier, and I will be your technical host for today's webinar. You'll see to the right of your screen beside the presentation is the chat pod. You can use this throughout the presentation to input any questions that you may have technically, or if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to enter it into that chat pod as we move along in today's session. Again, just before we begin, I just want to do a quick poll, make sure everybody can hear me loud and clear. So once again, the little person icon at the top of your screen, if you can go ahead and click on that, that would be great. Or you can select the check mark. There's a few options to select from the drop-down. Great. Perfect. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Paul Girbala to speak. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and welcome to all our guests. Thanks for joining us this afternoon as we take a look for the next hour at municipalities, sport, and long-term athlete development, which way forward. So we will present to you in the next few minutes some of the findings from a project that was a joint Parks and Recreation Ontario, Canadian Sport for Life project around integrating long-term athlete development in community sport and how municipal recreation could play a role. We'll have a chance to explore a little bit some allocation policies from City of Calgary and City of Mississauga, and we've got a couple of presenter special guests to talk to us about the allocation policies in their cities and the connection with long-term athlete development. And more broadly, take a look at how sport groups, sport councils, and recreation departments can support initiatives around quality in sport. So that should keep us occupied for the next little while. As Jennifer said, certainly as we go, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box. We will pick up on them, and I hope that at the end we'll have a couple of minutes possibly for verbal questions. So as I said, I'm Paul. I am a sport and recreation consultant, continue to work independently for over a decade now, but also on a contract basis, I'm Director of Knowledge for Sport for Life. We also have with us this afternoon Graham Jones. Says here special projects, Parks, City of Calgary, but he tells me that in the last little while he now has the title of Parks Operations Strategist. And so Graham is going to talk to us when the time comes about how Calgary managed some innovative changes to their allocation policies for sport fields. And we have Charlene Murray, Community Development Coordinator in the Sport Department of City of Mississauga, and Charlene will tell us about their ongoing project, recently revised new sport fields allocation policy. So let me get right into it and tell you a little bit about this project that we embarked on, which is just wrapping up now, but something that we did for almost 2 years, starting in 2014. Really, it was a two-part project. One part was around physical literacy and Parks and Recreation Department staff training and awareness around physical literacy. Drew Mitchell led that from a Sport for Life point of view, and some of you on the call may be aware or participated in that. My side of the project was in terms of long-term athlete development. We wanted to look at how municipal recreation could engage local sport groups to better support long-term athlete development implementation. So we worked with 3 cities on that side of the project, Hamilton, Kingston, and Mississauga, and within each of those cities with 3 sports, baseball, ringette, and soccer. Where there were sport councils, which was Hamilton and Mississauga, we also included the sport councils, and we also tried to include the provincial sport organizations as possible over the course of this project. We also looked at practices across Canada, which is how Calgary and some other cities come into it, as we looked at how they had adapted to using long-term athlete development in certain of their practices around working with their sport groups. So as I said, that's what we started out trying to do. We wanted to figure out a process for how municipalities, through their Parks and Recreation Department, could work better with local sport groups. We did that in 3 phases. The first phase consisted of really surveys and meetings, trying to understand the lay of the land in the 3 communities, culminating in January of 2015. Then we came back again looked at ways and means. What could we do together? Again, came up with ideas and circulated those later in 2015. And then finally, we looked at, again, practices in some other Canadian communities. Did a final round, open workshops in each of the 3 communities with a larger number of sport groups to bounce some of the concepts and ideas off them, test the ideas, and wrapped it up with a summary report. And of course, this webinar to tell you a little bit about what we learned. This slide speaks to the importance of local sport groups and what they mean in really Canadian society. Those of you who are on the webinar today probably all have connections to community sport groups. They are numerous. They are, of course, the largest single number of sport organizations in Canada. Of course, only a small number of national and relatively small number of provincial or provincial territorial sport organizations. Large number of community sport groups. Collectively, sport and recreation makes up over 20% of all not-for-profit organizations in the country. But again, as you know, these groups have very, very few staff. Many of them have no staff at all, continually challenged in getting or retaining volunteers to do their work, and most of their revenue comes from membership fees, relatively little of it from other sources. So local sport groups, community sport organizations, as they're called here, CSOs, are numerous, they're important, but they are challenged in terms of resources and ability to deliver their programs and meet the need communities in some cases. Now, you probably also know that over the last, well, in the case of the National Coaching Certification Program, maybe almost 30 years now plus, but in the case of some of the other organizations and programs that you see on the screen, maybe the last 15 years or decade, there have been a lot of programs and organizations focusing on how to improve the quality of community sport. So at the top you can see Canadian Sport for Life. Canadian Sport for Life, an organization that's the leader of the long-term athlete development model and also working to advance ideas around physical literacy. So these programs exist, but community sport groups don't always take up on them. The level of penetration or uptake in some cases is relatively low. When we ask sport groups whether they recognize all these logos, generally very few of them recognize all of them. Some people may recognize some of them. And when it comes to integrating them in their programs, well, in most cases it's discretionary. There's no rule or policy that says they have to adopt these programs at the community level. Doing so certainly costs some money, takes some time for training. When you have volunteer turnover, you have a challenge because you've trained one of your key volunteers and then they're lost and you need to retrain. As I pointed out, in many cases, sports don't necessarily understand why they would pick one of these programs over another, or whether it's more important to do one or another. So although there's a lot of programs available to support quality advancement, not necessarily a lot of uptake and certainly some challenges to doing so. Now this is the long-term athlete development model. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's essentially a stage-based model that speaks to how to help develop sport participants and athletes in every stage in terms of their training, competition, rest and recovery, and other needs. And the concept is quite simple. It's try to apply the right kind of training, the right kind of competition, and the right kind of rest and recovery to match the developmental stage of the performer or the participant. Every Canadian sport organization in Canada, just one more click to make sure they all pop up, every sport organization, a national sport organization in Canada, all 58, have now created long-term athlete development frameworks. It's the operating paradigm for sport in Canada. And yet, despite the fact that it is the paradigm, at the community level, not every community sport organization has adopted or follows long-term athlete development principles. Obviously, at Sport for Life, we think that these are absolutely key to having and delivering sport in a way that will keep everyone participating and involved and able to perform at a level which is appropriate to them. But we know that there is certainly a challenge for some years ahead to bring the whole country on board in terms of the long-term athlete development model. And if you go to our website, canadiansportforlife.ca, you'll see many, many examples of programs that sport organizations have developed to follow the long-term athlete development model. So this slide, you certainly can't see everything that's on this webpage, but what you can see is the first 3 stages of long-term athlete development across the top: active start, fundamentals, learn to train. On the left, on the vertical, you can see a whole bunch of sports. And what this is a list of adapted sport programs that those sports have created for those stages of LTAD in order to offer stage-appropriate programming. And it runs, the list runs down off the bottom of your screen, and it runs over to the right out of the side of your screen because sport organizations have, by this time, created well over 100 modified and adapted programs, and also have been working to modify competitions, maybe change the kind of equipment that's necessary for different stages of development, and take other steps to integrate long-term athlete development. The question is one of uptake at the community level. How do we promote uptake at the community level? Speaking to some of the other organizations and logos that I showed you a moment ago, there's a number of other organizations that support quality in sport. This is Club Excellence. Club Excellence is an accreditation model where community sport organizations apply and by meeting a set of standards can become accredited as Club Excellence clubs. What you can see in this one is that out of their standards, 30 standards, 9 of them have to do with sport delivery. That's on the left. You can see program delivery, bottom left is 5, coaching is 4. Well, built into that again is long-term athlete development. So one of the questions, or some of the questions are, does the community sport group follow LTAD practices? And that's necessary to be a Club Excellence club. So we see this, that the idea of LTAD is getting woven into all kinds of programs, all kinds of sports to advance the quality of community sport. And that brings us to the project. What did we hear as we worked in these phases with sport groups in the 3 cities, and how could sport groups work better with their municipal parks and rec department to advance quality in sport generally, long-term athlete development specifically? I picked the image of hurdles deliberately because the first thing that we heard is there's lots of hurdles. So in terms of what we learned from the sport groups, particularly in the first round, a number of challenge areas became evident. The one I've already mentioned about volunteers, a constant struggle just to find enough qualified coaches and volunteers to operate the programs. A variety of issues with facilities. In the case of these cities, the sport groups that we work with did not face a challenge getting enough facility time, but they had some other challenges around the location of facilities that they were able to access, hours, timing, quality of the facilities, and various maintenance issues, closure issues, field closures due to weather, and other kinds of similar issues. They identified members and parents as being a challenge area with regard to long-term athlete development implementation. Parents and members don't always understand LTAD, don't always understand why the club is trying to promote it. In some cases, say that they want more playing time for their child. They'd like the child to be on a winning team. They want to transfer to a team that's winning. So they identified a need for education. They identified some challenges around programming, just the challenges around adapting LTAD, understanding how they should modify their programs to make it fit long-term athlete development. Volunteer retraining needs. We have to retrain our coaches. Equipment and facility changes. A few years ago when Ontario Soccer started pushing long-term player development, they call it, there was a sort of a wholesale need to change field sizes and goal sizes. which created some challenges across the province, for example. Tournaments and hosting was identified as a challenge. In many cases, difficulty in getting extra facilities enabling them to host a tournament. They pointed out that when you host and bring other sport groups to the city, it can be a revenue generator for the city, and they didn't understand why that wasn't more taken into account when they were looking for these extra facilities. And then finally identified some challenges around the policies of their cities and particularly parks and recreation departments. In a couple of different areas, affiliation policies, in other words, how you qualify to affiliate with the city to access facilities, ice fields and so on. And then the allocation policies themselves, which is, of course, the way that the municipality determines which groups get what facilities. And one of the key things they pointed out was that none of these policies discriminate between good or not so good club programs. So if you're a community sport group and you're trying to do everything by the book, deliver your programs according to long-term athlete development standards and so on, you don't get any particular breaks or advantage over other sport groups which perhaps don't integrate LTAD at all, or in their minds are perhaps not offering as good a quality program. And they wanted to know why that was. So there were 6 main challenge areas that we heard from the sport groups. They wondered if the municipal facility staff always understood their sport-specific needs. Now, these 3 communities that we worked with all had sport development departments, and the sport development staff understood their needs, but sometimes the people who were, for example, maintaining fields or arenas were not necessarily as helpful as they could be, the sport groups thought. Maybe they didn't really understand why they needed to do things in certain ways, or they weren't able to support them in certain ways. Point I already mentioned about, no discrimination between high and low quality clubs and sport group programs. And consequently, they felt that there wasn't a lot of direct incentive provided for long-term athlete development or quality in general improvements. If we, for example, didn't talk about LTAD, but we talked about high five, they felt that, there wasn't any particular reason why they would take high five sport training for their coaches. They don't get more facilities, they don't get any other advantages, but it would cost them money and time, so where's the incentive? Leading to the big question, what can parks and recreation departments do? How can they recognize and support quality sport programs? And it kind of came down to this. On the one hand, the clubs saying, if you provided us better support, we could integrate LTAD. And the Parks and Recreation Department saying, well, if you integrated LTAD, then I'd be able to provide you better support. So it was a little bit of a circular discussion. Now, that was the sport group side. The other side, of course, is the municipal side. So looking at what we heard from the municipalities, in particular the Parks and Recreation Departments, we looked at affiliation policies. We looked at allocation policies. Mississauga, as I mentioned, has recently revised their field allocation policy, and Charlene's going to talk about that to us very, very soon. Hamilton, which was one of our cities, is just starting the process of looking at changing around their allocation policy. We also looked at some other cities, notably Calgary, and Graham is going to speak about Calgary in a moment, Edmonton as well, and some others. We looked at the supports that were offered. Again, as I mentioned, all 3 cities that we worked with had sport development departments. That's relatively rare and certainly was welcomed by the community sport groups in those 3 communities. Having dedicated parks and recreation staff that they worked with on an ongoing basis was certainly very helpful to them. Some communities have additional grant programs, Hamilton among these 3 in particular. So Hamilton offers, they offer grants, arts groups, cultural groups, and sports groups, which enable some sport groups to do some training or upgrading. And again, we saw that across the country there is an emerging movement towards communities having sport plans or sport strategies. So Mississauga has a sport plan, for example, as does Edmonton, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and others, Richmond, BC. These are becoming more and more common. So these were all ways that the Parks and Recreation Department, or the municipality more broadly, interacted with the sport groups in terms of both policy, procedure, and specific supports that they offered to those sport groups, enabling them to deliver their programs more successfully. So that's my overview, and certainly I hope I've given you a sense of the project and how we got started. I'm going to pass it now to Graham Jones, who, as I mentioned, is the Parks and Operations Strategist for City of Calgary. And Graham's going to walk us through a little bit of their journey in terms of their field allocation policy. Graham.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good morning from Alberta, and good afternoon out there in Ontario. I just wanted to give you a quick background on where we're coming from the City of Calgary's perspective. So City of Calgary, we're a fairly large municipality. We're a population right now of 1.1 million. Let me just open everything up here. We have over 360 registered sport participants in our city. We have over 400 CSOs, or community-level sporting organizations. Currently, we're allocating over 1,700 sport fields that are managed by our parks and our recreation departments. Right now, we've got over 1.7 million hours of field time that we're trying to allocate. And for us, that also translates into 530,000 or more hours of prime time. And for prime time for us, I'm talking Monday to Thursday, 6 to 9, which seems to be the only time that adults or their children are willing to play sports. Other things that we're dealing with at the same time in the last few years is our biggest user, who is soccer, has dropped their boundaries. So they went from having 8 distinct boundaries throughout the city to boundary-free, where any player can join any team they want and hop around. Anecdotally, some of the other things that we've noticed is that the groups, even though we have 1.7 million hours of field time, say that, well, there's not enough time available. And maybe it's not that it's not enough time, but maybe it's enough quality field time that they haven't been able to find. The other thing we're hearing a lot is that the organizations want more time for the younger kids. So again, anecdotally, we're hearing that the U6 and U8 kids, they need, 3 practices a week and 2 game slots, and we want our little Johnny and Susie out for 8 to 10 hours a week, even though they're 6 years old, and we really need them to get better with all this extra time, or they're not going to be able to further their soccer career. So what happened is we've been working with an outdated policy that went back to 2001 that sort of predated all the Canada Sport for Life and long-term athlete development stuff. And we bought into it hard here at the city, that we were big believers in it. So we realized it was time for us to update our sport field strategy. So that was something that we took to heart a couple of years ago, and we've been really focused on updating our strategy. So we went out and hired a consultant to help us do this, and the consultant gives us a few things. One, they're doing the work for us, but 2, they're providing that third-party perspective, so this isn't the city telling them that's what's best. And the consultants came back and basically gave us 4 things to work on. 1, that we should be gathering more data on our user groups. We should look at our rates and fees, our allocation policies and procedures, as well as developing partnerships. And our overall theme that we're looking for is getting the right athletes on the right fields for the right times. And for the right times has 2 meanings. That means that they're getting on at the right time of day, so that we're not having kids play too late. And it also means that we're giving them the right amount of time, so that we're not letting the clubs or the parents over-program little Johnny and Susie, who should be out doing piano lessons or just having actual unstructured free time. So we decided, again, like I said, that since we're big believers in the Sport for Life and LTAD model, that we were going to purposefully integrate that into our new strategy. And we were going to follow the recommended practices and policies that CS4L has put out. So if you go to the Canada Sport for Life website, this is a direct screen dump right from there. and I've starred 2 of their 6 principles and practices that we've decided to follow all 6, but the 2 that I've starred there are the ones that sort of have the biggest impact on what you're going to, or what we did as a municipality. So the first one is that the allocation practices that we use, or when we're giving out time, are going to be based on the standards of play, so the principles in terms of time and space. So we're only going to give the teams or the clubs the amount of time that they need based on how big their clubs are and the quality of space or the type of field that they're going to play on. As well, the second star there is that allocation is not done by tradition, but rather on actual requirements of all groups, including the needs of emerging sports. So for us, this meant historical bookings. Historical bookings have always been a big sticking point that everybody wants them. But what we've decided to do is we're going to say that we will continue with historical bookings, but only if you need them. So where does this take us? This chart that you probably can't see, but what it is on the bottom, this is our data gathering tool for all of our sports groups. So on the bottom we have 2 little charts there, one that represents House League and one that represents more of the community leagues. And this is a program that we piloted in 2012 and we've been using for the last 4 or 5 years. And what we did is we engaged all of our soccer groups at the time. So we piloted this only with soccer to say how many practices a week do you really need for each of these age groups? How many games do you really need for each of these age groups? And how long are those practices? And what field type should you really be on? And based on that information, it kind of gave us this is how many hours per week each age group would need. And we got all the soccer organizations to agree to it. Then what we do every year is we ask the groups, how many teams do you have in your organization? And then we put all that information into this spreadsheet that basically then just dumps out a number that says, organization X, you get the following amount of hours. And by engaging all of our groups prior to doing this, we had full buy-in that once we initiated this program, everything would be good to go. So again, this allocation filter takes all the numbers. It takes into account the skill of the athletes or their competitive levels. So are they rec, are they house league, and how old are they? And we've looked at the long-term athlete development model of practice to game ratios and added in a little bit of extra time for rainouts. And what it does is it gives each club an allocation amount of hours for games and for practices. And with the model that we've used, we're able to actually give them time on a specific field size. So maybe you have 100 hours overall, and 10 are on a major, 70 are on a minor, and so many more are on a mini. We've also decided that historical bookings, although the groups really like them, especially with the volunteer turnover that Paul was talking about, it makes it easier for groups to schedule knowing that they had the same time they had last year. But we've now said that you can have that same time, but only if the allocation filter says that you're allowed to keep those hours. So basically we now let the groups, if they're overbooked one year, the next year we'll let them choose from their list of times what they want to keep versus us taking away from them. And I think that's me in a very quick nutshell.
Okay, good afternoon. It's Charlene Murray here from the City of Mississauga. Just to give you a little bit of a background about the City of Mississauga, it is the 6th largest city in Canada and the 3rd largest in Ontario. It has an approximate population of 760,000 people. And just to frame how our allocation policy has to work, we allocate approximately 370 outdoor sports fields. This includes ball diamonds, artificial fields, cricket pitches. We have approximately 7 pitches, building 2 more, and plans for an additional one due to the demand of cricket facilities here in Mississauga, as well as our rectangular fields. These allocated fields are owned by the city or the 2 school boards. And the city's recreation division staff have followed an internal process to allocate and permit field time to approximately 150 affiliated and non-affiliated outdoor sport field user groups. However, this internal practice was not formally endorsed by Council, causing inconsistent allocation priorities and practices and not allowing sports field use to be maximized. So the wheels started to turn in September 2012 to formalize the management of an outdoor sport field policy in Mississauga. as it was just an informal process. So the project charter was approved in June 2013, and 2 years later it was finally endorsed by Council in fall of 2015, and this management policy has become effective for the 2016 season. So as you can see, it's still new. But the core group had to figure out like what kind of objectives or benefits that we would get for having a management policy. So first we wanted to ensure that we're maximizing our field usage, preservation, and performance. We wanted to respond to changing demographics. And the big one was we had a large discussion on the entitlement that reflects standards of play that align with the applicable sport governing bodies. So we felt that we as a municipality had a role of incorporating and aligning with Community Sport for Life and LTAD, and hence that's why we developed the policy as we have. Most of our group's allocation was historically based. We weren't sure how much time they really needed and how much they actually used for their permitted time. We don't want our sport fields empty, even if they are paid for, as we want to ensure that we have maximized our revenue. And our former mayor, Mayor Hazel McCallion, as some of you know as Hurricane Hazel, would drive around, look at some of our sport fields, see they were empty, but yet they were permitted. So, that was part of the task, is we could actually be making more revenue in addition to utilizing our fields if youth-affiliated groups were booking them. However, if they weren't using them, we could certainly rent them out to an adult or a commercial group and generate additional revenue. So we also wanted to ensure that practice and game time was allocated prior to tournament time. And we also incorporated it into a management policy so that we're managing our outdoor field operations in a cost-effective and efficient manner. So in order to embark on this process, we had extensive consultation. We developed an outdoor sport field user network. We met with them numerous times because we knew that if we didn't have all of their buy-in, that it would never get to council and get endorsed. So it basically took us 2 years to get the consultation piece through, and we not only met with the groups as a whole, but then we also set up individual group meetings when it came down to looking at the allocation or standards of play with the LTAD incorporated into it. So we certainly determined the allocation priorities. We have them listed on the slide here. And just so you understand, an affiliated youth sport group is a Mississauga-based group that provides organized league-based sport activities for youth and meets residency requirements, and those are identified in the policy. So soccer, for example, is 95% residency. Where a community sport group also means a league-based, not-for-profit, but non-affiliated youth or adult competitive sport organizations led by an elected board of directors with a minimum of 80% of participants being Mississauga residents. So we really want Mississauga residents to be utilizing our fields. The allocation priorities, we had other considerations. We had to look at what the group's priority ranking was. We also had to look at when the demand for outdoor sport fields exceeds available supply. Required fields will be drawn from group allocations in reverse order on the priority listing. So that's stated in the policy. The previous year's actual registration data for affiliated youth sport groups are used to project the next year's allocation. So player team registrations per age group must be submitted with the initial application to support the actual figures. The information to verify residency requirements must be provided to us as well to be validated. If additional hours were being requested, the organization must justify this need in writing. Groups should not accept additional registrations for new programs without first consulting with the city to confirm field availability. This was really key this year with our cricket allocation because we can't meet the demand currently. So for any group to build up their group, then it's even more difficult to be able to allocate what they require for practices and games. So Mississauga's developed standards of play for 3 sports, baseball, softball, soccer, and cricket, which incorporate the practice and game entitlements for each age level for seasonal requirements. Specific facility details have also been incorporated into the standards of play to align with the respective government bodies' LTAD requirements, and in addition to provide the city with the ability to identify capital infrastructure requirements. So we'll be able to tell whether we require more hardball diamonds or whether we require more 7v7 soccer fields, and this will be really helpful in planning budgets. When reasonable and feasible, the city will allocate field time to recognize and to gauge interest in an emerging sport, providing existing affiliated users are not adversely affected. So the group must submit a business plan to support the program and demonstrate that it meets unmet community needs. So requests for preseason play, tournaments, championships, and tryout field requirements will be submitted separately, but will be allocated in tandem with regular season play in order for the city to accommodate their allocation at the same time as seasonal entitlement. But as I mentioned earlier, seasonal play is more important. So the next slide gives you just a small look, because I couldn't fit in. We have 3 large formulas. So you'll be able to download our policy, and I'll provide the link shortly to you. But as you can see, it's actually quite similar to Calgary's in terms of looking at the numbers of players registered. So they would have to input in their last year's data, and we identify the minimum number of players that they have to have on a team, and then they actually incorporate in the actual number of teams, and then we identify what kind of entitlement that they get for practice time and game time. So at the end of the day, we determine what the total hours per week is, and then divide it by the number of teams, and that gives the organizations a number that they work with, and they coordinate and how they determine where they want to utilize it on what fields. But at least we have an idea from the application process how many 5v5 fields we need, how many 7v7s, how many 11v11s. So we have one for soccer. There's also a separate allocation formula for soccer development, so this one specifically would have been for recreation. And we define youth up to 21 years of age, and that was through consultation with all our groups. So 21 and under is considered youth in Mississauga, and because, for example, baseball have a lot of junior teams. So after that, then they'll be considered adult, and they aren't incorporated with LTAD. Because of the cricket and demand for cricket, that is why we also did a separate allocation formula for them as well. So this has been our first year of implementation. It's been a process. The groups recognize that it's important to incorporate standards of play. However, some groups follow it and some groups don't. But as a role of the municipality, we're trying to certainly influence them that it's important to allow kids to have the practice time and the game time that they're entitled to have. So the effectiveness will be reviewed annually. We'll have a much better idea next year where we're heading into, but right now we've been able to meet all our group's needs with the formula. So next year we'll be getting their statistics from this year and going from there. So we actually also see how certain age groups are increasing in terms of demand, or where a sport organization may need some support from the municipality in terms of promotion for younger age groups or older age groups getting involved in the sport. So it also assists us with identifying marketing needs for the groups. So if you'd like to download the policy, the Outdoor Sports Field Management Policy, this is the link that you can go to and access it off of our main City of Mississauga website.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Charlene. It was certainly a pleasure working with Charlene through the project. As I said, Mississauga was one of the 3 communities we worked with, and thank you very much as well to Graham. I think that for those that of you on the webinar this afternoon, you can see that both of those communities invested a great deal of time and effort into getting it right as they looked at revising or introducing new allocation policies, and they definitely did an outstanding job of making sure that they did it on an evidence-based approach that really both took into consideration the needs of their community sport organizations, but also the standards of play approach, which was heavily based on long-term athlete development and some of the standards for what sports should be doing at different ages and stages, and how that plays out in terms of their facility needs. So 2 really, really great examples of practical approaches to updating allocation, integrating ideas or thinking around quality sport and delivery of quality sport. So thanks for sharing those. I'm just going to return now as we kind of go back to the second part of the project. And so this was our key question. How can recreation departments recognize and support quality sport clubs so that sport clubs can better integrate long-term athlete development and more broadly improve the quality of their offerings? And we also took a look at the question of program standards. Yes, not just allocation standards, but other standards that could be put in place or considered that clubs would meet in order to get additional support, let's say. And finally, who else could help? What kinds of partnerships or work could be done in the community, community sport councils or other kinds of allied groups? How could they support the process? So that led us to our 3rd round of workshops. And as I said at the outset, we took a look at both the sport organizations, the local sport groups, what their needs were, what their comments were. We took a look at the municipalities and the parks and recreation departments, what their realities were, what they felt they were able to do. As you heard, one of them, Mississauga, had already developed a new field allocation policy. What else were they doing? What else could they do? We took those, we kind of rolled that together, and we came back to sport groups in the 3 communities with a set of ideas. I won't call them recommendations, I'll call them ideas. And those were in 2 parts. So first, a large number of questions about how could the recreation department support a range of different activities, including volunteer training, use of youth as volunteers, youth mentoring, possibility of offering try-it days, other kinds of promotions. Remember, these came from the sport groups themselves saying we would like support in these areas. Better communication to the sport groups, giving the sport groups more awareness of, for example, grant opportunities or other supports that were available. Other kinds of supports that were available for tournament hosting or volunteer development and training or purchases of equipment. Better coordination with facility staff and other municipal departments. When we talk about, for example, hosting, we might be talking about working with economic development or municipal tourism or other groups. And, what could we do just generally to promote the idea of sport quality programs to parents, whether that be having a certified coach, integrating long-term athlete development, use of high five, or others. So how could we promote quality to parents? So we had our 3rd round workshops. We talked about all of those things, and we tried to use the sport groups as a sounding board about how do you feel this could be done? What could we do together? Now, there was a second set of things that we explored in these workshops, and this was the idea of offering incentives or some kinds of preferential support if sport clubs met quality standards. You remember that the sport group said, even if we spend more time and more money and we train our volunteers and we change our programs and we try to comply with long-term athlete development, we don't see any direct payback in terms of support from the municipality. So we said, well, okay, how about these ideas? What about different levels of affiliation with incentives? What about the idea of quality standards that would be integrated into the facility allocation process? So if you meet a standard, then you might get first dibs, for example, when it comes to allocation. What about linking the actual facility use to recommendations? So if you meet a set of standards, then we can offer a certain allocation that's keyed more directly to the specific group that you're working with, much as you heard in the case of Mississauga and Calgary, those standards that they used in terms of figuring out their allocation process. What about promoting quality clubs or sport organizations through municipal means? What else could we do to promote higher caliber local sport groups and their programs? And what else could we do to promote, again, those programs to parents and residents? What additional supports could we give to make sure that everyone in the community understood that a local sport program that offered high quality services was available, and direct people, or at least make them aware that those groups were offering quality programs. So we explored all this in these workshops. We basically asked the sport groups, okay, we heard this from sport groups, now we want to bounce it off you. What do you think? Could we do these things? How do you feel about doing these things? And you probably wonder what they said. Well, the first thing they said is they really would welcome these things. They found it valuable to get together in the workshop, and they would certainly welcome some kind of periodic information sharing opportunity, whether it was a summit, workshops, semi-annual gatherings, something of that nature. They really felt that it would be valuable to promote the need for certified coaches, long-term athlete development, and quality in general to the public through the media that the Parks and Recreation Department had at its disposal, whether through websites, print, or other kinds of ways of communicating to the municipal residents. They really thought that it would be valuable to have support for sport promotions like Try It Days. And they would welcome some kind of targeted support. They recognized that it wasn't possible simply to provide money to all local sport groups, but some kind of targeted way to enhance volunteer training and development. So those were a bunch of things that, out of the list that we gave them, they felt were the most important and that they would really welcome. Now, of course, the other question was around standards. We said, well, what do you think about standards? Would you welcome meeting standards in order to get preferential or additional access to resources like facilities? Actually, they didn't. The sport groups had many questions about that, and they saw a number of potential problems with a standards-based approach. I would say most notably, they felt, or they were concerned, that the smallest sport groups wouldn't be able to meet the standards and the largest would, and that therefore small sport organizations might be disadvantaged. The Recreation Department staff also saw some disadvantages or some problems with the idea of implementing standards. One that I already mentioned, just how do we take into consideration the very different sizes and capacities of these groups, and also questions about how would we adjudicate, how would we determine who meets a standard and who doesn't? How would we audit? How would we know that they actually meet a standard? So generally speaking, neither the sport groups nor the recreation departments saw standards-based incentive as being very feasible. So that kind of brings us to the overall conclusions that we drew from the project. Number one, dialogue is valuable. Everybody felt and agreed that bringing the groups together in order to discuss these kinds of issues was very worthwhile and instructive and useful for everyone concerned. Often when municipal parks and rec departments bring together their local sport groups, they do so just because they want to do a facility allocation meeting, the winter ice allocation meeting or the spring field allocation meeting. Going beyond that to having a broader discussion about some of these issues, how do you improve program quality? Are you aware of the supports that the municipality has available for you, like our grants program? Are you aware that we have a summit coming up in 2 weeks? Those kinds of things would be very useful. The second point was that generally any kind of support or partnership or any kind of targeted incentive that would promote quality in community sport would be helpful and welcomed by sport groups if it could be made available to them. Simply having a sport development department within Parks and Recreation, having dedicated sport development staff, was already a great step. And the 3 communities, as I said, Hamilton, Mississauga, and Kingston, all did that, and that was recognized as valuable. But the other kinds of supports and partnerships were also very important, whether that was in Mississauga's Sports Summit that they organize annually, whether it was Kingston's working group that they convened about 2 years ago and has met since, whether it was other kinds of initiatives like Hamilton's grant program.
The
They
host
were all
has left the
valuable.
meeting. So at this time, the meeting will come to an end. Thank you and goodbye.
Hi everyone. We seem to have had a bit of an issue with the audio. Please select the person icon at the top of your screen just to ensure that you can still hear me.
To connect your please, you will now read.
Paul is second to join us. Paul, are you back on the line?
I believe I am. Can you hear me?
You are. Yes, you are. So that's perfect. Weird. The phone just cut out for some reason, but everybody can hear us now, so we're all back on the phone line. So sorry about that, Paul.
Great. Yeah, a little dropout there, but we're back, so I will I'll continue where I left off. As you can see, really interesting how long-term athlete development is emerging as a tool for municipalities to use as they revise their allocation policies. And that, of course, was something that we heard about from Charlene and Graham. I think we're going to be seeing it more frequently as municipalities deal with these issues of how do we do or update our allocation policies. In many cases, allocation policies have been based on historical or traditional information. It's often recognized that they're in need of updating, but because of some of the political dimension and challenges that were anticipated, it's been hard for municipalities to do that. By using an evidence-based approach and using long-term athlete development as a framework, the national framework for sport development, it does make it a little bit easier and provides municipalities a way into looking at or re-looking at their allocation policies. So that was an important conclusion. And then finally, just this idea of having further multi-level discussion, and by that I mean both community or municipal level and provincial level, and the links between them, even national level and the links between them around quality sport delivery would be really useful. So again, the province, of course, supports municipalities in many ways. There are many grant programs and other kinds of direct supports for infrastructure development and so on. Better discussion would lead to better focus on quality sport to ensure that all residents have a chance to participate in high quality sport programs. That kind of alignment would be a very valuable outcome of this kind of a project. So, sorry about that little glitch in there, but that brings me to the end. So we have a couple of minutes left. and certainly any further questions. I see there's been some in the chat box or ideas you'd like to share. I think we have time to do that. Do we, Jennifer?
Hi, Paul. We do have about 5 minutes. Most people are joining us right now via the chat. So if you wanted to enter any questions right now, you'd want to do so in the chat pod there. There are a few people on the phone line with us, and if they wanted to contribute anything or ask any questions, they can just simply select *6 to unmute their phone lines, and they can join us over the phone as well.
Great, thank you. Well, again, certainly you can enter a question in the chat box or a comment, and those of you that are connected through audio, you can raise your hand and be recognized as well. And we do have a couple minutes left if you'd like to do that, so take advantage if you have a question.
And I can maybe answer Lynn's, she's got a couple of questions in there. So first, does LTAD influence indoor space? Yes, that's the next stage for us. We've done our outdoor, so we'll be moving this to our indoor space. And the info about specialization in small-sided groups or small-sided games, we totally believe in that. However, we have no influence on that right now. That's being handled by our group. So we do see U6 kids that are specializing as a forward for soccer already, which we think is awful, but we don't have any control over that yet. So we don't give any benefit to any group who is organized in a way that doesn't go show specialization. But we are seeing a lot of small-sided games start to come out in all the different sports right now.
Great, well thanks for that, Graham. I saw a couple people were typing, but then no comment came up, so I'm not totally certain whether they had anything to ask or contribute. Oh, now we have multiple attendees are typing. Adobe Connect's pretty primitive. It goes 1, 2, everyone. So it'll show a name that's someone's entering a comment, and then it'll say multiple attendees are typing. Jennifer shares that we are going to post today's presentation on the slides. So that's something we're happy to do for everyone. Let's just see, a couple more comments perhaps are going to appear here in the chat. Oh, question from Gina. Great approach to making the playing field consistently fair based on level of play. Doing the research, was there a noticeable difference between allocation of male versus female teams in sports? Well, it's a question I think for both Graham and Charlene.
No, I would say. Everybody has been treated equally, as most female organization and male organizations are run exactly the same way, and we've always been giving time out in the same fashion up until now.
Yeah. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me?
I can.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay, great. We incorporated something in terms of non-residency requirements because softball organizations are more like a regional versus City of Mississauga. So if we did incorporate in, so we are allowing them 40% non-residents to participate in order for their leagues to continue to be functioning. So with that respect, we made some changes, but in the actual allocation standards of play part, we didn't.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Graham and Charlene. I think that brings us around to the end of our time. And thanks again to everyone for being on with us this afternoon. Thanks one more time to our special guest presenters, Graham and Charlene. Really enriched, I think, the webinar. See a note here from Lynn. Umbrella physical literacy, same public awareness, yeah, And Jennifer wishes everyone a lovely day. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.